Have you ever felt an unexplainable pull towards something forbidden, something that whispers danger even in silence? Lucas Almeida would soon find out that in some places, the rules are there to protect you from the unknown itself. The story begins with Lucas, a young architecture student moving into a towering, eerie building that feels alive with secrets. Shadows seemed to cling to the corners, while flickering lights barely illuminated the narrow hallways. It was a building from another era, worn by time, and heavy with an unsettling quietness that seemed to watch his every move. On his very first day, Lucas felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, like ghosts haunting his every step. Neighbors, most of them elderly with hollow eyes and whispers that barely reached above the hum of the dim hallway lights, had only one warning: stay away from apartment 13. They spoke of it as if it were a place cursed, a door that held something darker than anyone dared explain. But instead of fear, their words only sparked Lucas's curiosity, a dangerous spark that would soon consume him. Alone in his new apartment that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the warnings were more than just superstition. Why would a simple apartment be so feared? As the hours crept by, silence settled like a heavy fog over his apartment, broken only by an occasional creak from the old walls. And then just past midnight, Lucas heard it, a faint rhythmic sound, like something scratching softly against metal. The sound was coming from the hallway outside. His heart raced as he quietly moved toward his door, peering through the peephole. The hallway appeared empty, but the scratching continued, growing louder as it seemed to move closer, toward the infamous apartment 13. If this mystery is gripping you, leave a like, subscribe, and prepare to follow Lucas into the depths of apartment 13, where fear has a life of its own. That night, as Lucas drifted into an uneasy sleep, he found himself standing in the dim, narrow hallway outside apartment 13. The air was thick and cold, carrying an oppressive silence broken only by the soft hum of the building's ancient pipes. The hallway felt familiar yet wrong, like a faded memory turned inside out. Shadows loomed at odd angles, casting twisted reflections on the cracked walls, and a faint coppery scent hung in the air, sharp and unsettling, as if the very building were bleeding. He reached out toward the door, his fingers brushing against its rough, weathered wood, and immediately pulled back, feeling a sharp, icy sting, like the door itself had a pulse, a warning. In the silence, he heard a faint whisper. At first, he thought it was a draft, a trick of his mind, but the murmur grew louder, forming words that twisted and overlapped in sinister fragments. "Welcome, your turn, trapped." The words seeped from the other side of the door, carrying a chilling familiarity, as if some part of him had always known this voice. It echoed from deep within the apartment, like voices from a forgotten past, pleading and taunting. Suddenly, the door handle turned on its own, slowly creaking open, revealing only darkness beyond, a thick, impenetrable darkness that seemed to breathe, pulling him closer. Lucas tried to resist, but his body felt heavy, moving forward as if under a spell, compelled to cross the threshold into the apartment. He stepped forward, his feet sinking into the floor, which felt soft and damp, almost organic, like walking on flesh. The walls around him pulsed gently, each beat echoing his own racing heart, and the smell of decay grew stronger, filling his lungs with every breath. He heard the whispering again, this time closer, surrounding him. It was as though the apartment itself were alive, feeding off his fear, luring him deeper with each step. As he moved forward, he reached out, trying to steady himself, only to feel something sharp and cold latch onto his wrist, a skeletal hand emerging from the darkness, gripping him tight. If you're already feeling the chill, brace yourself for what comes next. Remember to subscribe, like, and join us as we uncover the horrifying secrets lurking within apartment 13. The nights that followed only grew darker for Lucas. Each time he closed his eyes, the dreams pulled him back to that endless, pulsing hallway outside apartment 13. But now, the details became sharper, more insidious, as if the apartment was drawing him closer with each visit, binding him to its unspoken horrors. This time, the air was suffocatingly thick, tasting of damp earth and iron, clinging to his skin like a second layer. Flickering lights barely cut through the haze, casting eerie shadows that slithered along the walls, shifting and contorting as if they were alive, mocking his every movement. As he approached the door, he felt a sickening dread creeping up his spine. The whispers had returned, louder now, shifting from indistinct murmurs to distorted voices echoing in a chaotic symphony of terror. They called his name in broken, overlapping tones, some pleading, others mocking, all merging into a single chilling chant. Lucas tried to back away, but his feet seemed glued to the floor. The old wood creaked beneath him as if the building itself was breathing, anticipating his every fear and feeding on his hesitation. Shadows reached out from the cracks in the floor, snaking up his legs, cold and heavy, pulling him closer to the door. When he finally reached the door, he noticed something strange, a small dark stain spreading along the bottom, seeping from within, like blood leaking from an open wound. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, fingers brushing against the chilling metal. Suddenly, the door jerked open on its own, revealing an impossible sight, a dark room stretching into infinity, lined with mirrors on every wall. His own reflection stared back at him from countless angles, but each version was twisted, distorted, their faces smeared with horror, eyes wide with silent screams. Each reflection seemed to move just a fraction behind him, as though they were trapped, clawing at the glass, desperate to break free. Lucas felt his breath catch as he stepped into the room, and in an instant, the door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in. The mirrors began to pulse with a life of their own, showing glimpses of faces he didn't recognize but somehow felt he knew, ghostly figures, each bearing a look of terror that mirrored his own. Then, in a horrifying realization, he saw one figure step out of the mirror. It was himself, yet it wasn't. This twisted version wore a menacing grin, eyes empty, filled with something dark and hungry. It took a step toward him, the mirrors around him vibrating, and he felt a hand clasp his shoulder, ice-cold and relentless, holding him in place as the figure leaned in close, whispering in his own voice, "You can't escape. Not anymore." If this nightmare is gripping you, remember to like, subscribe, and follow Lucas deeper into the twisted corridors of apartment 13, where his darkest fears are waiting, lurking, and whispering his name. The dream had tightened its grip, turning Lucas's sleep into a relentless descent into terror. In his latest nightmare, he found himself once again trapped within the walls of apartment 13, but this time, the room was no longer just a dark, empty space. Now the walls seemed to breathe, stretching and contracting, as if the very structure was alive and aware of his presence. Every inch of the room was covered in strange symbols etched into the decaying wallpaper, pulsating with an unnatural, eerie light. The air was stifling, thick with the scent of rot, and Lucas's own heartbeat seemed to sync with the rhythmic pulses emanating from the walls, dragging him deeper into the apartment's nightmarish embrace. As he took a hesitant step forward, the floor shifted beneath him, soft and unsteady, like he was walking on flesh. The walls around him began to close in, inching closer with every heartbeat, as if they wanted to swallow him whole. Suddenly, a low guttural sound echoed through the room, a deep, menacing growl that sent chills racing down his spine. Lucas froze, his eyes scanning the darkness, but he could see nothing beyond the distorted shadows that danced along the walls. The growl grew louder, transforming into a chorus of whispers, each voice laced with malice, calling his name in fragmented tones that felt disturbingly familiar, as if he were hearing echoes of his own thoughts twisted into something monstrous. In a desperate attempt to escape, Lucas turned toward what he thought was the door, only to find it gone, replaced by an endless corridor stretching into pitch-black oblivion. The whispers intensified, now surrounding him on all sides, hissing dark truths and cruel promises of what awaited him. His skin prickled with a sense of impending doom as he took a step forward, only to be stopped by the sudden sight of a figure standing at the end of the corridor. It was barely visible, shrouded in shadow, but its eyes glowed an unnatural, piercing red that cut through the darkness, locking onto Lucas with a predatory gaze. He felt paralyzed, unable to move as the figure started to advance, each step slow and deliberate, with a disturbing grace that defied human movement. Just as the figure was about to reach him, Lucas's vision blurred, and he was jolted awake, gasping for air. But his relief was short-lived. As he sat up, he noticed something impossible. Clinging to his arm was a dark, viscous substance, smeared like a grotesque reminder of his nightmare. His heart raced as he scanned the room, only to realize that the symbols from the apartment were faintly etched into his walls, pulsing with a dull glow. A lingering whisper echoed in his ear, chilling him to the core, a promise or perhaps a threat: "You belong here forever." Now, Lucas could no longer ignore the pull of apartment 13, nor the dark truth waiting to consume him. For those who dare venture further into this tale of dread, remember to like, subscribe, and join Lucas as he faces the twisted horrors lying in wait within apartment 13, where dreams bleed into reality, and escape may no longer be an option. Awake but shaken, Lucas couldn't shake the lingering presence of his nightmare, a weight that clung to him long after he had left his bed. The symbols that had appeared on his walls in the dream had faded, but something in the air felt charged, as if the apartment was holding its breath, waiting. Driven by an overwhelming need for answers, Lucas decided to delve into the mystery surrounding apartment 13. He began asking the building's residents, hoping for some rational explanation, but the responses he received only deepened the mystery. The few neighbors who dared speak to him seemed reluctant, almost afraid, whispering that everyone who had lived in apartment 13 had vanished, leaving behind nothing but their belongings, and an echo of dread that no one could explain. Lucas's curiosity led him to the building's archives, a dusty basement room filled with brittle old papers and neglected files. As he sifted through the yellowed documents, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold: a series of missing persons reports, all associated with the same address, apartment 13. Each report described eerie circumstances, residents complaining of strange noises, whispers in the walls, and dreams that grew darker and more disturbing over time. Lucas recognized the symptoms too well. The timeline in each file seemed to mirror his own descent, as if he were retracing the steps of those who had come before him. In a hidden drawer, Lucas uncovered an old photograph, worn and slightly burned around the edges, depicting a group of people in front of the building. Among them, one figure stood out, a young man who looked eerily like Lucas himself, staring into the camera with a look of haunted resignation. Written on the back of the photo was a cryptic message: "Once you enter, there's no way out." Chills ran down Lucas's spine as he realized that this figure wasn't just a look-alike. It was as if he were staring at his own reflection, a distorted, timeless image that defied all logic. Could it be a cruel trick of fate, or was something far more sinister at work? As Lucas staggered back from the file cabinet, his hand brushed against something cold. He looked down to find a key, the same ancient, tarnished key from his dream. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to leave it alone, but the apartment's grip on him had already tightened, pulling him in with a force he couldn't resist. Clutching the key in his hand, he knew that whatever apartment 13 held, it was bound to him, its secrets woven into his very being. There was no turning back now. He was entangled in a web of terror that had ensnared countless others before him. If you're ready to unravel the terrifying truth alongside Lucas, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay with us as he takes the final steps into the unknown. The shadows of apartment 13 hold many secrets, some of which are better left buried. But for Lucas, and for those who dare to follow, there is no escape from what awaits beyond the door. Lucas could no longer tell where his nightmares ended and his reality began. Every moment spent awake felt like an extension of the horrors lurking within apartment 13. Determined to escape the terror that had seeped into his life, he sought out the help of one of the building's oldest residents, Mrs. Morera, a reclusive woman with piercing, knowing eyes. She had lived in the building for decades, surviving what countless others hadn't, and whispered rumors claimed she knew secrets buried within the walls. When Lucas knocked on her door, she opened it only slightly, her gaze both wary and pitying, as if she understood the dark path he was walking. In her dimly lit apartment, surrounded by the scent of dried herbs and candle wax, Mrs. Morera told him about a curse that bound apartment 13 to the souls of those who dared enter. She spoke of the dark doorway, an ancient gateway that drew people in through their nightmares, trapping them in a space where time, memories, and reality dissolved. She warned him that the apartment fed on fear, growing stronger with each new occupant who entered, feeding on their despair until they were nothing more than echoes in the shadows. The only way to survive, she hinted, was to sever the apartment's hold over him before it was too late. But her warning came with a chilling condition: Lucas would need to confront the entity within apartment 13, face to face. And to guide him, Mrs. Morera handed him a relic she had kept hidden, a small cracked mirror encased in tarnished silver. She explained that it would reveal the apartment's true form, a twisted reflection of reality that hid in plain sight. With the mirror as his only guide, Lucas felt the weight of what lay ahead. A part of him wanted to run, to leave the building forever, but he knew that no distance would free him from the apartment's grasp. That night, Lucas stood outside apartment 13, clutching the mirror as his final hope. The hallway was silent, each second dragging as he felt the apartment's darkness bleeding through the door. His hand trembled as he raised the mirror, watching his reflection distort, his face stretching and warping until he saw something else, a shadowy figure standing just behind him, its face a mask of terror and madness. The door creaked open, as if inviting him in, and with a last glance down the hallway, Lucas crossed the threshold. Inside, the world around him twisted immediately. Walls stretched and contorted, the floor pulsed beneath his feet like living flesh, and the air reeked of decay and fear. Lucas held the mirror up, revealing shapes lurking in the corners, their forms shifting between memories and nightmares. His own reflection in the mirror began to speak, its voices but warped, warning him that he could never leave, that every step forward was sealing his fate. The mirror began to crack under the pressure, splintering with each word, until only one piece remained, showing Lucas's own horrified eyes staring back at him, trapped forever in a place where fear ruled. If you felt the chill of Lucas's journey so far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and prepare for the final confrontation. What awaits him in apartment 13's darkest depths is a truth that may be better left unspoken. Lucas stepped further into apartment 13, feeling the darkness close in around him like a thick, suffocating fog. The room was alive, pulsing with an energy that felt ancient, malevolent, as if the walls themselves were watching, waiting. Shadows twisted and writhed along the peeling wallpaper, and an unnatural chill sank into his bones, deeper than any cold he had ever known. The room had rearranged itself, morphing into a grotesque version of his own apartment, distorted and fragmented, as though the apartment had consumed pieces of his life and twisted them into its own dark mirror. He gripped the broken mirror Mrs. Moreira had given him, his only lifeline in this place of nightmares. As he raised it, he saw figures move just beyond the glass, faces he recognized from the missing persons reports, each one frozen in a scream, eyes hollow, trapped in a loop of terror. They stared at him, pleading silently, as if they had been waiting for him to end their torment. Each face told a story of fear and agony, reflecting what he too would become if he failed to break free. But Lucas felt the apartment's hunger intensify, tugging at his mind, trying to ensnare him in its web of fear. In the midst of this horror, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a twisted version of himself, but older, worn down, with eyes that gleamed with a mix of hatred and despair. This version of Lucas was gaunt, his face pale and cracked, as if he were barely clinging to life. His doppelganger's voice echoed in the room, warped and hollow, dripping with bitterness. "I was you," it hissed, stepping closer. "I was once curious too. I ignored the warnings. And now, I am the apartment's prisoner, just as you will be." The figure's twisted smile spread, each word punctuated by a surge of dread that made Lucas's blood turn cold. Panicked, Lucas tried to step back, but the door behind him had vanished, replaced by a wall that seemed to pulse, closing in on him. The mirror grew heavier in his hand, and he realized it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. Summoning his last shred of courage, he lifted the mirror between himself and his doppelganger, forcing the figure to look into its own reflection. The specter recoiled, its form distorting and writhing as if being consumed by the mirror's fractured surface. A guttural scream erupted, filling the room, as cracks spread across the walls and the darkness began to unravel, piece by piece. But as his doppelganger disintegrated, Lucas felt a sharp, sudden pull. The apartment was fighting to hold him, refusing to let him go. The ground beneath him began to split, revealing a chasm of shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly, pulling at his legs, dragging him toward the abyss. In a final act of defiance, Lucas hurled the mirror into the darkness, shattering it completely. The fragments exploded in a burst of light, piercing the apartment's shadows, and the faces within the mirror seemed to vanish, released from their torment. As the light faded, Lucas found himself alone, lying on the floor of his own apartment, gasping for air. The room was silent, still, and the familiar hum of the building returned. The nightmare had ended, or so he thought. As he rose shakily to his feet, he noticed something chilling on his wrist, a thin black mark spiraling around his skin, like a brand, a permanent reminder of his descent into apartment 13. He had escaped, but the apartment had left its mark, a silent promise that it was still watching, and waiting. If this final confrontation has left you breathless, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your theories. Could Lucas truly escape, or will apartment 13 call him back someday? Lucas may have escaped the immediate grip of apartment 13, but as the days passed, he felt a lingering shadow that haunted his every step. Although he had returned to his life, something was off. The world around him seemed subtly altered, like a distorted reflection of what he once knew. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear faint whispers, fragments of the voices he had encountered, as though apartment 13 was still speaking to him from a distance, calling him back. Each night, the air grew heavier, and shadows stretched unnaturally long, creeping closer, as if they held secrets only he could understand. Strange events began to follow him, creeping into his daily life. Items in his apartment would shift locations, subtly at first. A chair moved slightly out of place, a door left open that he remembered closing, small things he could almost ignore. But the disturbances escalated. He would catch glimpses of his own distorted reflection in mirrors, eyes hollow and filled with fear, vanishing the moment he blinked. He started waking up in the middle of the night, cold sweat covering his skin, only to find the same black spiral mark on his wrist, darker and deeper, as though it were burrowing into him. One evening, Lucas's phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. It was a single sentence. "Once you enter, there's no way out." His heart raced as he recognized the message, the same haunting phrase he had seen written on the back of that old photograph. He tried to trace the number, but every attempt led to nothing. No history, no source, as if the message itself had come from nowhere. It was then he realized that apartment 13 wasn't done with him, that perhaps he had never truly left it. He began to question everything. Was he still in the real world, or was he merely wandering within another layer of the apartment's nightmare? In a final act of desperation, Lucas visited Mrs. Morera, hoping she could offer some closure or guidance. But when he knocked on her door, there was no response. The neighbors told him she had moved out, or perhaps vanished. No one seemed to know for sure. As he walked away from her empty apartment, he felt a strange compulsion pulling him back toward the hallway where apartment 13 resided. Standing before the sealed door, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu, a feeling as though he had been standing there for years, trapped in a cycle he could never escape. The door remained closed, silent and foreboding, but Lucas could swear he felt something on the other side, pressing against it, waiting for him to step forward. With his heart pounding, he slowly backed away, whispering a silent promise to himself that he would never return. But as he turned to leave, he noticed the black spiral on his wrist pulsing, a reminder that no matter how far he ran, apartment 13 had marked him. He would always be connected to it, bound by the fear it instilled, haunted by the shadows it left behind. The question lingered in his mind, gnawing at him with each passing day. Was he truly free, or had he only crossed into a different layer of the apartment's twisted reality? For those who followed Lucas's journey, the story may be over, or perhaps it's only beginning. What do you think? Has he truly escaped the grip of apartment 13, or is he merely a prisoner in another version of its nightmare? Leave your theories in the comments, subscribe for more chilling tales, and share this story if you dare to uncover the truth that may lie just beyond your own door. Remember, some doors should never be opened, but once they are, they may never close. As Lucas moved forward with his life, a quiet but ever-present darkness followed him, clinging to the edges of his thoughts and lurking in every corner of his apartment. Though he had escaped apartment 13, the line between reality and nightmare seemed thinner, like a veil that could tear at any moment. Shadows appeared longer than they should, stretching toward him, and even in broad daylight, he felt eyes on him, hidden yet relentless. Objects around him would vanish for days only to reappear in strange places, as if the apartment's essence was still reaching out, distorting his surroundings in subtle but terrifying ways. The spiral mark on his wrist, now nearly black, pulsed faintly whenever he felt that familiar chill. It seemed to carry a heartbeat of its own, a constant reminder of his brush with the apartment's twisted reality. And at night, as sleep pulled him into darkness, he would hear them, the voices soft and insistent, calling his name, urging him back, as though apartment 13 were still waiting, still wanting. Each morning, he'd wake drenched in sweat, with faint whispers fading into the silence, but his instincts told him that one night he might not wake up in his own bed at all. Unable to find peace, Lucas decided to research the building's history, digging deeper into local legends, stories that most had dismissed as superstition. He uncovered a chilling pattern. Every few decades, someone would vanish from the building, always a tenant linked to apartment 13. And those who were left behind spoke of feeling haunted, bound to the apartment as though they too had been marked. The building's records were sparse, filled with unexplained disappearances, residents who seemed to dissolve from reality, and lingering tales of a dark presence that lured the curious and the desperate into its grasp. The pattern was undeniable, as though apartment 13 existed not as a room but as a passageway into a world that no one could truly escape. As Lucas read through the last document he could find, a brittle yellowed paper warning tenants to stay clear of apartment 13, his phone buzzed with a notification. His heart dropped as he read it. "It's time to come back, Lucas. You belong here." The message had no number, no sender, and as he looked up, he saw his own reflection in the window, but something was wrong. The reflection stared back with empty, hollow eyes, lips twisted into a mocking smile that didn't match his own expression. He stumbled back, his pulse racing, only to see the reflection lift a hand and point, as though urging him back toward the door he had tried so desperately to leave behind. Now, even Lucas can't be sure if he ever truly escaped, or if he's still wandering within a layer of apartment 13's nightmare, drifting between illusions of freedom. Each step feels like it's pulling him closer, each whisper a reminder that he's never truly alone. Apartment 13's grip remains unbroken, and its darkness lingers, waiting patiently for his inevitable return. So, what do you think? Did Lucas ever escape, or is he still trapped in the apartment's endless maze? Share your theories in the comments. Hit the like button if this story left you chilled, And make sure to subscribe for more tales that might just keep you awake at night. Remember, some doors should never be opened, because once you step through, you may find that reality is far more fragile than it seems.